Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today is going to be kind of just sort of creating, just working through a line of thought that comes up every once in a while. It's not uncommon when you deal with leaving any religious paradigm that people will say, well, when you leave religion, you're going to have a God-shaped hole in your heart, and you're just going to fill it in with some other religion, some other way of thinking that's no more or less legitimate than the religion that you left. And it got me thinking about this God-shaped hole in your heart, or this religion-shaped hole in your heart, because there is an element of truth to it. But we've talked before how the shape of that hole becomes important because it gives you some insight into the needs that you have as a human and how religion and God filled those needs. And knowing that you had been abused by a deception before which exploited those needs should kind of be a life lesson in trying to avoid that type of abuse in the future. And I think that's why it's important as you leave a religious paradigm that used deception and manipulation to control you. It's important to kind of unpack that and really look into it so you can try to understand those aspects of yourself which kept you in that system, to try to navigate your world and your life after that. And so we came up with this concept called the God-shaped hole. Let me see if I can share my screen here and maybe we can get a little bit, and this is I've just put together some slides using some basic clip art in Google Slides, and we're going to kind of build a little bit of a presentation here. If Yu-Gi-Oh will let us. Yugi, you going to let me do this? Okay, you see this? Fetch. Go get it, Yugs. All right, he'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, so here we've got the God-shaped hole in your heart, just a line of thought we're going to follow. So here is us. And this is just an iconic representation of us as a whole. As we zoom in a little bit more, we go about our lives day to day, looking at the world around us in a way that is shaped by our upbringing, by the messaging we were taught from our teachers, our parents, our community, about how to look at the world, how to look at ourselves. And if you happen to have grown up in a strict authoritarian religious paradigm, much of that worldview is shaped by God and religion, specifically how religion uses the concept of God and certain aspects of your human psychology to bind you to them as a religion and shape your identity. And that identity then informs how you navigate the world. And if we were to take people at how they kind of glibly use this paradigm, they'd say, well, you leave religion, you have a God-shaped hole in your heart, and you spend the rest of your life trying to find the meaning and the love and all of the things that religion provided for you because your life is now empty. And so the rest of your life is spent in searching for a way to fill that God-shaped hole in your heart. Maybe you'll find it in whatever secular organism or organization that you find or some other way. But I want to go back and see this as something much more complex than a circle representing God. And that is, I want us to understand that the God-shaped hole in your heart is not simply a circle with the word God or the name of a religion in it. That's a very superficial way of looking at it. Instead, you should look at the things that fill very normal, very human needs that all of us have. And if you take each of those different things, give them its own shape as part of the whole of what religion meant for you, then you can see that it is much more than just a simple circle. There's at the center of this, and this is just kind of how I conceptualized it using just a few very broad concepts. You can go into fine detail and make the shape of this particular thing much more complex by digging deeper in your own life and your own experiences and finding out what it is that religion served for you while you saw it to be true. And so I put at the center of this, wanting to have a purpose in life. Tied in with that purpose was hope and security, because it was the uncertainty about life after this, about your connections to your family. In Mormonism, those are very important central elements, and they drive all of your participation and your adherence to the religion, because it is by adherence that you're able to fulfill your purpose, that you're able to have a hope for the future, that you're able to feel security in your eternal existence. On top of that, and connected to it, are some very personal needs that each of us have. Wanting to feel worthy. And when I talk about worthiness, in this case, it is connected with Mormonism's own sense of worthiness, but I think Mormonism perverts it. And that is just feeling worthy of love, worthy of being loved. And I've listened to a few therapists who deal with, some of the, I guess, areas of our life that aren't commonly talked about. There's a physician named, or a therapist named James Cantor, who's dealt with a lot of people dealing with sexual trauma, with the issue of human sexuality in general. And even when you look at paraphilias, people who have unusual fetishes and so forth, one of the things he said is that the common thread in all of these things is that these people feel a deep insecurity about, with their particular unusual way of being, whether or not they are worthy of love. And that's a big part of the therapist's job, is to help people to find that space where they do feel themselves worthy of love. But religion does this in a very different way. And in the Mormon sense of worthiness, feeling worthy is deeply about feeling worthy of love, whether it's worthy of God's love, worthy of the love of your family members, or worthy of even loving yourself. A second aspect, as we look over here on the right side, is just feeling good. Feeling that you are a good and moral and just person is an important, essential aspect of being for a majority of people. And certainly there are people for whom this is not important, and they see themselves as beyond good and evil. But for the overwhelming majority of humans, this is something that is tied closely with their own sense of self, is a desire to feel good. On top of that, the desire to feel special. If we feel like we're just one number in a huge population, it kind of takes away our own sense of the dignity and value of our individual life. Whereas if we're seen as something special, then it adds meaning and it adds significance to our time here on earth. This plays in very deeply in Mormonism, because we're told that we are indeed gods in embryo, and that the whole of existence that we're experiencing on life is something that we will be able to provide to other people, to other soul spirit children, as we become fathers in heaven ourselves by enduring to the end. Tied in with all of these things is a strong foundation and a desire for belonging, for wanting to feel like you are both a part of a group and accepted in that group. And there's a sense of security and purpose in that belonging. And there's a sense that you don't have to do everything yourself, and just the very human need to be part of something bigger than yourself. Now, in Mormonism, this God-shaped whole does a phenomenal job of being filled by all of the various theological and metaphysical answers that the religion gives us to these needs and these questions. But it's all locked in by obedience. Our sense of security, our sense of worthiness, our sense of goodness, our sense of specialness and belonging is all dependent and hinges upon our obedience to the demands and expectations of the religion. And when you go through the process of leaving the church and realizing that the answers that they provide with authority lose their legitimacy, when you realize that that authority is made up and claimed out of the founder's imagination and passed on through the various leaders of the church. And so all of their answers are no more valid than the vain ramblings of some guy on the street corner. And so to completely shape your identity and your life based on these things takes away your ability to shape your own destiny and to shape your own identity, because it's being infused with these illegitimate points. And so you lose the significance of those things, and that part of your life which gave you that sense of identity and that sense of well-being disappears. Obedience is now immaterial. It doesn't even matter, because you don't need to gain the favor of those in authority in order to have those answers secure in your life, because you realize those answers themselves are illegitimate. And so you have this as something closer to what I would envision the God-shaped hole in your life is. And as you go through your life, you see that while the answers and the solutions that the church provided for you fade, because you see that they are no longer reliable, it doesn't take away that void in your life, those needs that they filled. Now, this isn't to say that the church itself created those needs out of thin air and then filled them. These are very human needs, things that people have struggled with throughout human civilization. They are innate to each of us just based on our existence as human beings, our possession of human psychology. And so as we then go throughout our life, that God-shaped hole isn't really defined by God or religion. It's actually defined by our own human needs, and all of us have them. Not only that, but the things that can come along and try to fulfill those needs don't have to come from religion. They can come from any place. And just as religion sees these shapes and tries to fill them and lock you into obedience, other things can do that as well. So if we were to take the example of an abusive relationship, usually it starts out in a honeymoon phase. And so you'll have somebody who comes and gives you a great deal of flattery, telling you that you're special, that you're the only one, that there's so many unique and special things about you. And this messaging is filling a need that you have to feel special, particularly if you've left a relationship, whether it's institutional, religious, or otherwise. You've left a relationship that was filling those needs, and you feel that emptiness now. You are particularly vulnerable to someone who comes in and tries to give you those needs. And so you have that feeling of specialness, and you succumb to it, and then you start to feel the secondary effects that go along with that. So you start to feel that you are worthy of love, because this person is love bombing you with all of these messages about how special and unique you are. And you start to have that sense of belonging that you used to have in your past relationship, and now you're finding fulfillment of that need in this relationship. And you start to feel all of these things come together again, and the various things that you used to rely on for feeling whole start to come back. We'll send this backward there, and then we'll give this. But it's a very different shape. Now, if in fact these things, I mean, it's a different color in this case. Now, if in fact these things are good for you and healthy, then there's no problem. The problem comes in when you start to see that the same barrier to you being able to fill those things authentically comes into play, when there's another seal on it with this lock of obedience, where you don't actually have access to any of those things, being special, being worthy, having purpose or hope, unless you obey, unless you do what is expected of you by that same authority figure who dishes those things out. And so in the paradigm of an abusive relationship, you may get love bombed, you may get all of these benefits, but as soon as you do something that that person doesn't like, then you get the opposite of that. You get degraded, you get insulted and demeaned, you get told that you're not worthy, and you learn very quickly that you have to play the game, you have to obey, you have to do things the way that this person who's provided these needs for you wants you to have it done, and that dynamic then plays out. And you've been dependent on that before in the church, and you suppressed your own sense of worth so that you could earn the worth that the church gave you, and played out your role in that toxic relationship. And you have to deal with it again now in your new relationship. Now that's taking a look at this from the dynamic of a toxic relationship, but there's other ways to look at it. So just as we saw people in the relationship fill this in with their own color, you can have other religious paradigms that come in and try to do the exact same thing. So if you went from Mormonism to Jehovah's Witnesses, then you would find another way to feel special. You would find another way to feel loved. You would find another way to feel all of these different things that Mormonism provided you, because the doctrine and the theology and the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses exploit those same human vulnerabilities, just with slightly different flavor. And so you would find all of those things were still there, and on top of that, it would still have the need for it to be gate-kept with obedience. And so you've got other religious paradigms that will exploit those human vulnerabilities of that God-shaped hole to lock you into what they need. And then you've got things that don't have anything to do with relationship or with religion, but still exploit those needs. And that is when you lose religion. One of the things that you lose is a way to know that you are a good person. Because in the religious paradigm, your goodness is defined by your adherence to the moral framework of the religion. And that moral framework makes sense to you because it comes from an authority. And you know the authority is legitimate because it comes from the very mouthpiece of God. If you leave religion altogether, you don't lose that desire and that need to feel that you are a good person. And so you will find that there are plenty of people out there telling you what it means to be a good person. And you're going to find people today frame goodness in terms of oppression and divide the world between those that are oppressed and those that do the oppression. And the power of doing that is that you, again, if you're somebody who's looking at the world in this way, then your ability to place something in the category of the oppressor gives you the ability to designate something as good or bad. And that gives you the ability to have people see themselves as good or bad based on whether or not they support it. And so as you look out at all of the pressing social issues of our day, just pay attention to how people define things as good or bad. Because there's a way that I would say is fairly extreme and radical of looking at this question of good or bad and saying that anything that is dominant or oppressive, or anything that is dominant is oppressive. And if it is oppressive, it is bad. And so let's look at things that are dominant. And you could say, well, if somebody has a lot of wealth, then they are dominant. They didn't earn that wealth all on their own. They don't deserve that wealth. They're hoarding that wealth, and so they are bad. And so things which denigrate possessors of wealth are good. And if you get in line with that, then you are good. So you start to see the world as divided between classes, the haves and the have-nots, And you again now have a framework where you can see people as good and bad based on a particular moral spectrum. Then you could say, well, people who are inherently beautiful are oppressive of people who are not. And so we've now got to demean beauty as an oppressive social construct and start to elevate those things which previously have not been seen as beautiful, because beauty is in itself oppressive. And so you start to find people who start to lean into those aspects of themselves which are previously not in the same paradigm as normal beauty. And along that comes, discussions about what is actual beauty. And all of those things feed into your building framework of what is good and what is bad. And like many things in religion, many of these points about what is good and what is bad are legitimate at a certain level of examination. But like any other ideology, when they are taken to extremes, they distort reality and they end up leading you to make decisions and choices that you would not otherwise make. You could even say that the most classic example that we're seeing recently is the idea that if something is logical and it is right according to research, according to science, then it is bad because science itself is a Western construct that is oppressive of indigenous ways of knowing. And so you throw out science because it is dominant. And if it is dominant, it is therefore oppressive and therefore bad. And that thought process taken to extremes is something which takes on a religious element in that it fuels this aspect of how we see ourselves as good and how we divide the world into good and evil. And when you get together with other people who start adopting this way of looking at the world, this way or any other ideological way, then all of these other benefits start popping up as well. Because you get together with other people who look at the world through the same lens of the oppressors and the oppressed, and you feel camaraderie with them, you feel belonging with them. They say, you're really good at articulating those different things. You're worthy of love in that social group. Because you see the world as differently than anyone else may see the world, in that you're able to articulate all of these things based on these ideas of society being divided between oppressors and oppressed, then you start to see the world and you find belonging and you find community. And because you've got this vision of what the world could be if it just let go of all of this oppressive way of being, then you are starting to find hope for the future. And when you get the idea that all of your efforts in changing the world and bringing down the oppressors are going to bring a glorious future, it gives you all of those things: belonging, purpose, hope, security, goodness. And all of these things are filled by leaning into the ideology. It's not religious, but it has a moral dimension to it. And when you connect with other people who think the same way, you start fulfilling all those other contours of the God-shaped whole. And it becomes something that can be as controlling of your life as anything else, because what you've got now is a whole set of ideas and beliefs that are rooted in philosophy and assertion, not rooted in objective reality. And if you start to have any doubts, if you start to say, well, I don't think we should see 2 + 2 = 4 as being oppressive of other answers, because we kind of need math to be heterodox from those perspectives, those ideological perspectives, then suddenly you get cast out. You get told that you're stupid, you're bigoted, you don't see the world the way that you're supposed to see the world. And so you get punished, and you realize very quickly that you have to obey, you have to submit to the ideology. Just like in religion, you had to submit to the religious ideology. In this paradigm, you have to submit to the secular moral ideology and the worldview that goes along with it. And if you don't do it, you get the same punishment. You lose this sense of belonging. And just like it's difficult and painful to lose the church, then you'll find the same phenomenon of, and when I say organization, it doesn't have to be somebody with a single charismatic leader. It doesn't have to be an organization that has buildings that you can walk into and visit. It can be an organization that is simply the group of like-minded people that exist wherever they are, that can share messaging in social media or otherwise. So if you hope to avoid falling into this pitfall, what do you do with the God-shaped hole that fills? And remember, it's not so much a God-shaped hole as it is the contours of your psychology, which can be exploited by religion or any other thing, whether it's a relationship, a single relationship with a single person, a family relationship where there may be a parental dynamic to it, or a secular ideological or political relationship. What do you do with these contours? And I think this is where it's really important to understand your vulnerabilities, understand your need for feeling good, your need for being loved, understand all of those things and how they can be exploited. And this is where some people say that turning to an ethical and evidence-based therapist who is not tied to any particular ideology can be helpful, because they'll help you find and fulfill these things on your own terms, so that you can continue to seek out and find fulfillment in those areas of your life that can give you a sense of specialness, a sense of worthiness, a sense of goodness, and a sense of hope and security and togetherness, but they don't come with the padlock of obedience, because those things are established and carried on your own terms. They come from within you in connection with those people that you allow into your life and that you allow yourself to be vulnerable with, understanding that if they betray that trust and that vulnerability, that you are able to draw a boundary that protects yourself and the core of your own sense of personal integrity and well-being. And so the lock never shows up. So there are a couple of red flags in terms of, how do you know when this is going on? Because if you remember, when we looked at this toxic relationship, the lock didn't show up right away. First, specialness, being worthy of love, all these other good aspects showed up. And the lock that demanded your obedience in order to have access to those things in the future showed up after you had already become enmeshed with all of the love bombing and messaging of it. And that can happen both in individual relationships as well as in ideologies and other religious paradigms. And so it's important for you early on to be able to figure out when you're going down that road, when you're seeing those red flags. And so I think that's where it's important to spend some time and talk about what are those red flags. So let's see, if we were to, let's create a new slide here. And let's change the layout of that slide. And we'll call this something like red flags. Okay, we'll just call this red flags right now. So what are some of red flags for these types of terrible relationships, whether they come from individuals, organizations, or religions or ideologies? Well, I think an important one to realize is isolation. If they tell you that you need to cut out of your life anyone who doesn't think the way that you think, who doesn't see the world through the same prism that you do, you need to minimize your exposure to them. Anything that gives you an identity transplant. And what I mean by that is that they try to dissociate you from any roots that you may have had before you enter into the organization or enter into the ideology. And the way they dissociate you can be subtle or it can be overt. Now, you can study different cults and religious paradigms, and you can see the way that they do this is a little bit more overt. So in many cults, what they'll do is they'll give you a new name. And so if you watch the documentary on the Heaven's Gate cult, and if you've watched their exit statements, you can see that all of them are given the suffix Odi at the end of their name, and they're given a few letters before that. So you'll have Mel Odi and Sin Odi or Hey Odi or something like that. But what it did is it took away their individuality. It took away their connections to their families of origin. It took away to their sense of existence and their sense of identity before entering into the group, so that they took on a new existence as part of the group. And it became easier then for the leader to separate their minds now in their existence now in the ideology of the group than otherwise, because their name is totally different. And it's that sense of dissociation that makes them even more vulnerable to the psychological manipulation. Okay, so then there's something called Defu, which I probably should have a connection here. And this is just another expression of the same thing. So FOO stands for family of origin. And when you defu, what you're doing is you're breaking ties with your family of origin. And this is centered in with another concept called neo-family, which is that, you know, the family that raised you, that gave you your sense of identity and your sense of well-being in your early formative years, they don't really know what's good for you, and they don't know what's best for you, and they've shielded you and forced your authentic self from actually existing. And so you've got to break ties with them because they're bigoted, they're hateful, they're backwards. And we've got to expand what a family actually is. And you can find your new family among the people in this new way of being, this new ideology. And this, again, what they're doing is they're filling that part of the God-shaped hole or the U-shaped hole, which needs belonging. And so this neo-family then are all people who are enmeshed in this ideology, and they are going to be the ones who will look out for you. So defuing is trying to remove the way of thinking that your family of origin gave you, cutting off ties with family, not speaking to your parents, not speaking to your siblings, or limiting your exposure to their influence in your lives, not letting them know what's going on in your life, the things that you're learning about. Shielding your existence and your identity from them so that they no longer are able to influence you, because it's the new family, the new ideology that will influence you, and taking that name away from you. That name is something that connects you to that family. So when they take it away from you and give you a new name, they're saying that we are now your family. We are now giving you this form of existence. And this is a very common trope that you'll see in cults and even in political movements. Even the sense of calling you, we're not going to call you by our names now, we're going to call you by a title, whether it's brother or sister, or whether it's comrade or ally. These names then are a new form of identity that you're given that have significance, that's tied into the ideology that they come from. And it's a form of dissociation, making sure that they are the ones who get to keep the boundaries of what is proper and can go into your head. And so this concept of an identity transplant has a bunch of different facets to it, but it's a red flag. As soon as you see an organization is trying to completely overtake and reshape your identity, everything that shaped you up to the point that you interacted with them, then that should cause you some concern. Wait a second, why do you need to strip me of my identity? And just let that be something that causes you at least to start having doubt. Okay, so Next thing is doubts or criticism suppressed. So as soon as you start to see that there are things about the organization, things about the ideology, that if you raise questions about, they start to say, they don't answer your questions directly, honoring that they may be legitimate questions, but they add a moral dimension to it. They say, you're wrong for asking that question. If you even allow that train of thought to happen, then you are bad. You are wrong. You can't doubt. You can't question. If you question, you're on the other side. And in some cases, it may be about religious things. If you question the existence of God, if you question the legitimacy of our leader, then that is Satan working upon your soul. It can also happen in political things. If you question whether or not our political leader won an election, then you are on the other side. And it can also be on ideological things. If you question whether or not something that we have labeled as hateful or bigoted is actually hateful or bigoted, if you question that, then you are on the side of the haters and the bigots. And so those types of labeling, branding, diminishing, demonizing doubt or questions are a big red flag. And it may not happen all the time, but to the extent that it does happen, you should say, wait a second, that is a red flag that I've become trapped or I'm dipping my toe into an ideology which is exploiting my need for togetherness, for goodness, for love, and is going to be bound to bind me down with that padlock of obedience and compliance. And before you get too far, just back up and start asking questions. Okay. Did I spell suppressed wrong? I don't know. Okay, so another thing is us versus them. As soon as the group that you're in has started to divide the world to those who are on the inside and those are on the outside, that's a big red flag. The world is much more complex. The reality of each of us as individuals with our own experiences, our own priorities, our own values means that it's very rare that you're able to divide the world into us versus them. When you do that, you start robbing people of their ability to be individual, to have their own thoughts, to have their own ideas if they don't conform to a particular ideology. And whether that is a litmus test that you apply to yourself or a litmus test that you apply to the rest of the world, just the fact that there's this litmus test it should be a red flag. Now, none of these things on their own are necessarily something that should cause you to immediately walk away, but it should cause you to think. Okay. And you'll probably realize that a lot of these things mirror some of the items that have been discussed recently on the Mormon Stories podcast. When you listen to Luna Lindsay Corpton talk about mind control or undue influence techniques, that's because a lot of those things are exactly what it is that are the red flags. It's just if you don't actually take time to identify what they are, you don't realize what they are. You just kind of think people are talking and being persuasive. Well, there are ways of being persuasive that are rooted in legitimate, logical, moral persuasion. And then there are ways of persuasion that exploit your own psychological vulnerabilities. And so understanding the difference between those and being able to detect it is very important. Okay. The other thing that is important to take into consideration is the source of authority. You know, as humans, we navigate our world, we take data in, we try to make sense of it. We understand that we're not perfect. We can misinterpret data. We can be mistaken in the way that we see how events have taken place in history, how the events are unfolding before us. And each of these groups that come and start to insert themselves in our lives, each of these ideologies that may come and shape how we see ourselves and see the world, come from some source of authority. There has to be some reason for you to accept their views of how to shape the world or how to see the world over your own senses or over your own experiences. And so pay attention to where the authority comes from and really examine that closely. And this becomes important because there is, I think anyone who's left Mormonism can understand why this is important. So in Mormonism, the decrees that we get from God's leaders come from the prophet of the church. He is the mouthpiece for God. Well, why do we believe he's the mouthpiece for God? Well, he says so. And his counselors say so. Okay, well, why do we believe that? Well, they inherited the ability to say so from the leaders before them. Okay, well, where did those leaders get that ability? And you just follow it all the way down, and it goes to Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith claimed that God spoke to him and that God anointed him as a prophet in this dispensation. And so we had to believe the things that he says that God said. And so people who are kind of navigating this journey, learning why we think, why we believe, and do what we do as Mormons, will then look at the life of Joseph Smith and say, well, wait a second. God also instructed him to secretly and illegally marry some of his foster children behind his wife's back. Why would God do that? God supposedly told him to command people in his circle to give money so they could build up a hotel. Well, why would he do that? The Nauvoo house. God commanded him to promise a 14-year-old girl that her whole family would gain salvation if she would be sealed to him as a wife. Why would he do that? And so when those questions start adding up and you realize that if any other seemingly religious leader was to do that, you would say, you know what? Those breaches of sensibility, those obvious distortions of real morality impeach his claim to be God's prophet. He's just another religious charlatan who's using the voice of God to command our obedience. And so everyone who came after him claiming authority back to Joseph Smith, you can kind of disregard because he kind of impeached himself. And so then knowing that understanding, follow back to where these things came from, look at what they did, and then you can kind of impeach that authority. There's other religious paradigms. If you go into the Jehovah's Witnesses, you can explore that and see that's not really what you want. That also exists in the world of secular morality. So if you go and you start seeing the way that people are defining the world as good or bad, you'll find a lot of people saying, well, we need to look at much of what goes on in our existence as social constructs. And those social constructs are arbitrary in that they are just what our society by convention said was normal. And normal is actually a form of oppression because normal tells you what you think is good and what is bad. And there's no reason that things that are abnormal should inherently be bad. They're just different. And so we need to break apart and deconstruct the idea of normalcy. And we can do that because normal is just a social construct. And so there's nothing solid behind it. So let's do that. Let's explore the potentialities of being through a process of deconstruction where we ask ourselves, what really is normal? What really is common? And then just allow ourselves to broaden our minds. Now, there's a great deal of value in realizing that there are aspects of our life and our existence that are arbitrary. The idea that pink is feminine and blue is masculine is arbitrary. And you could go to a different time in history and see it's totally different. The idea that the desired body shape is thin and svelte is a social construct. You can go back to a different time in history and see that the desirable body shape was big and bulbous. And it was the idea that, you had so many resources that you could be fat and lazy. But, there's some value to that, but where do these ideas come from? And this is where it's actually very enlightening to realize that. So just like you can trace ideas back to Joseph Smith and Mormonism, in the secular world, this idea that things that have power of dominance are oppressive is a notion that is attributed to this guy named Michel Foucault. He's a French philosopher. He made some important observations of how social constructs and the way that we perceive things have a form of power to them. So if you get a piece of information and you are told that this piece of information is validated by science, there was research that was done and it came to this conclusion, there's a power to that bit of information because it is attached to science. And Foucault further explained that there have been instances in the past where this notion of science gave power and endorsed to things that we see as very deplorable. The fact that there were mental institutions where if somebody had a mental disability or a personality disorder, you would just throw them into an asylum, and that was the right and ethical thing to do. Well, when you see that that was being done to people who were homosexual, or were on the margins of what would be considered normal, from our present day understanding, we see that as absolutely an inappropriate use of power. Well, his idea was we should throw out this notion of science having any legitimacy at all. All of these things are pure expressions of power, the way that people in dominant groups oppress people who are not dominant and keep them subjugated. And that's a very appealing way of thinking, because then you can start to look at the world around you as power differentials and power hierarchies. And you can start to be critical of people who are dominant and feel good for doing it because you're a moral, just person for doing that. And, this process of asking yourself what these things actually represent, should they actually be dominant? Should they be normal? It ties into this concept of deconstruction. And deconstruction is tied in with the power of words and labels and things that we start to measure and quantify and name our world with. And I think George Orwell in 1984 does a great job of showing how an understanding of this real power of words to shape our reality was something that the party took very seriously. It was the whole motivation of Newspeak, which is that if you can limit the vocabulary of the population, you can limit their ability to see that they are oppressed. And so there's some truth, just like in Foucault's power dynamics or biopower or power knowledge, there's some truth to it, but it can be taken to extremes. And this is what I mean by taken to extremes, because this question of, well, what's normal? We're limiting our potentialities of being by holding to this notion of normal. It's really brought into stark contrast when you see where Foucault and Derrida took that line of thinking. Because if you just Google Foucault, Derrida, and pedophilia, you can see that they lent their names and their philosophical energies to a call in France at the time to decriminalize and to normalize sex, intergenerational sex between older people and children. Because children, the idea that children are not sexual beings or shouldn't be aware and participant in sex is a social construct. And it's just because of a happenstance of history that we have gotten that are into our head that they shouldn't be involved with this. And so it's the same sort of process where you see the people who came up with the ideas that are being promulgated and used to infuse how we demonize certain things in our culture. Ask yourself, where do those ideas come from? Trace them back and back and back. And then you'll see that there are people who claim that this is how the world should be interpreted. And they do so not because of any objective reason. They do so as a philosophical assertion. This is their opinion about how the world should be. And then take it to an extreme that you probably don't agree with. Now, the same thing can happen. And that whole line of theory came into, you'll hear people attribute it to postmodernism or critical theory. And those are things that those philosophical threads led into, where we look at power dynamics, where we look at identifying and deconstructing social constructs which are arbitrary and limit our ways of thinking about the world, where you take a intense look at the words that we use, what they mean, even looking at how somebody who creates the word, creates a piece of literature or creates a piece of art, their intention in doing those things no longer matters. All that matters is how you interpret it. All these things are fed into this philosophy and this way of thinking that can be summarized as critical theory. And so if you just Google critical theory primer, then just learn about it, just read about it a little bit, and you'll realize that critical theory is what feeds into two of the most prominent moral frameworks that you're going to encounter coming out of Mormonism. One of them is called critical race theory. And it's looking at the issue of race in a way that is informed by these philosophical assertions. Now, each of these different branches have certain philosophers or, figureheads who really gave them their energy early on. In the realm of critical race theory, you'll see Derek Bell is a name. The other side of that is something called queer theory. And Queer theory is a way of looking at our concepts of gender and sexuality through a lens that completely blows apart how we even consider those things, whether or not biology has anything to do with sex or gender. Before this theory came onto the scene as the result of philosophers, primarily starting with Judith Butler and others, before this appeared on the scene, there was not much separation in terms of sex and gender. There was a concept that there were aspects that were certainly social constructs we talked about before, things that would be considered feminine or masculine. Just the idea that they were feminine or masculine just meant that they were social constructs associated with a certain sex. And so that became manifest as gender. But they were arbitrary. You could still say that you like something that is stereotypically associated with a different sex, but that didn't change your sex. It just was a different part of you. So if you were a girl and you liked blue, the fact that you liked blue didn't mean that you were really a boy. It just meant that you were a girl who liked blue. And that's something very simple. You could take it even further than that. But critical theory transformed into queer theory has totally reconceptualized how we think of those things. And so Judith Butler is another example of someone where you can go back, see where she shaped this thing called queer theory that is now compelling us as a society to reimagine and reconceptualize gender, and realize that she used the same philosophical arguments and the same performativity, the same deconstruction, the same questions about, these things that we consider normal are really just social constructs. Well, just Google Judith Butler and incest, and you'll see that she used a lot of the same lines of argument to say that there's really, the fact that there's a taboo for incest is really just a social construct, and that we need to start conceiving of a world beyond that. So these examples are just to show you that anytime you latch on to some sort of moral framework, it's important to try to understand where it came from. Not that you have to discard important aspects of that moral framework, but that you have to understand that there are limits to where these things can go if you go into extremes. Because all of these things have extremes that you can go to, whether it's a political ideology, a religious ideology, or a secular moral ideology. Look at the extremists and make sure that when you start getting involved in any of these ways of thinking or knowing, that you understand where you won't go beyond. Because just like in Mormonism, there's this concept of radicalization, where somebody can start out sort of involved in the ideology, but then their identity becomes tied up more and more into it, and they learn more of the secrets, more of the deeper knowledge, and then they start seeing the world as more and more of a stark contrast between us and them, good and bad, and that leads them more and more into more extreme ways of thinking on the religious paradigm. That process of radicalization happens in religion, but radicalization also happens in political ideologies. So someone can have a philosophy, whether it's Democrats or Republicans or Marxism or any form of political ideology, and they can go radical and start taking the most extreme notions of it, notions that start to deny the humanity of people who don't think the same way. That's another red flag, if we'll go ahead and add that to this, which is dehumanization. As soon as your ideology starts to diminish the humanity of other people for not thinking the same way, that's a huge red flag. Anyway, that's just this process of radicalization can happen both in religious and political as well as in just philosophical ideas. To what extent can these ideologies shape your own sense of identity and sense of self? Well, if you take time to watch I think it's called The Cult of Cults. It's on HBO Max. It's the story of the Heaven's Gate cult that ended in a mass suicide. One of the things you learn is as the people involved in that group became more and more radicalized, following more and more of their leaders' teachings, which got more and more outside of the mainstream, they had adopted new identities. They had taken on new names. They had cut themselves off from their families. And to the extent that anyone in their family didn't agree or tried to warn them about what was happening, they would see that as a sign or a reason that they need to distance themselves further from that family member. Anyone who would criticize the leader, they would see as just not understanding the pure light that they have. The ideology shaped how they saw themselves, because they saw themselves not as just humans living for a period of time on earth, trying to do the best they can. They saw themselves as gods in embryo who were going to evolve beyond this stage of humanity into a higher sphere of existence. And because they were gods in embryo, they had to cut themselves off from some of the more carnal aspects of human existence that were tied to this world and to this body. And so they were told that those aspects of their lives which determined their sex, which had to do with their sexuality, their human sexuality, with whether they were men or women, those things needed to be eliminated because they were antagonistic to their reality as these divine spiritual beings who were going to ascend to the plane beyond human. And that led them to self-mutilation, where the men, the leader, attempted to castrate themselves and ended up in an emergency surgical procedure. They ended up going to, or pretending to go to, a different country so that some of them could have their genitals removed in pursuit of this identity that they had as these heavenly creatures. Now, if you were to take any of these people at this moment in time, they had to have a deep sense of belief in the ideology, in their identity as members of this group and what they were going to be. They did not feel complete or whole with the influences that their genitalia were giving to their bodies, and so they had to cut them off. If we were to take any of those out of them and inform them that this guy used to be a music teacher, the guy who's telling them that they're ready to ascend beyond human, he used to be a music teacher, he himself is a repressed homosexual who's the son of a preacher who felt a lot of self-hatred over his own homosexuality, who taught these things as a projection of his own self-hatred, which was in turn informed by another broken ideology, but that the way that they saw themselves as broken or less than or wrong for having genitalia was informed by a philosophy that was an ideology from a very disturbed man. They may not believe you. In fact, they probably wouldn't believe you. They would say, no, this is who I am. Allow me to go forward. And we as a society, seeing how, outside of the closed circle of information that they have, could see that the choices that they're making to mutilate themselves are informed by distortions and manipulations and not by objective reality. But because that's the world that they now see themselves in, we're torn between protecting them from the abuses of an ideology and respecting the fact that people have free agency and free will and they can do things. And it's a struggle that we all have. But that's why it's important to realize that ways of distorting your sense of self based on ideological radicalization can lead you to such dramatic distortions that you want to harm yourself and remove aspects of your identity that without the ideology you would not have a problem with. And it's a disturbing thing that we know exists because you can see it happen in Heaven's Gate. So the question is, can ideology distort your sense of identity so much that you're willing to mutilate your genitalia? The answer is yes, it can happen because it's happened in the Heaven's Gate. And if that can happen, you've got to ask yourself, what other ways can ideology change how your sense of identity either can or will help you feel a sense of wholeness? And that's something that I think as a society we have to really wrestle with, because there's one way of thinking that says, well, religion is simply a bunch of assertions, and if you leave religion, then science is just a bunch of assertions. Any way of thinking is a bunch of assertions. And so really, any way that you want to think it all is fine. Just, anything's fine. Don't worry about it. And that openness is full of landmines, because there are things that you can find where people really do get manipulated into doing things that they would not do if they had not been subjected to a certain degree of indoctrination, if they were not subjected to an environment where those vulnerabilities that we started out talking about that made up the contours of that God-shaped hole, those vulnerabilities can be exploited by any of these ideologies. And that, I think, is why cult documentaries are so cool, because you can see how they're exploiting different things in a very extreme way. And then look at the world around you and just say, what are some of the other things that are tapping into these same human needs, fulfilling those human needs, and then distorting the view of people who may hold these views, distorting the identity, the sense of self-worth, the sense of integrity. Anyway. All right. So like I said, this was just going to be rambling musings. And let's see. I think that's all that I have for today. From my perspective, the goal is to get back to where I can have a sense of all of these things in my life as I exist, and I'm in control of them, where I'm not having to subvert my own priorities, my own values to some authoritarian thing, whether it's a religious leader, a political group, or an ideological mob. I don't want to have to submit to these things. I just want to exist, to be able to find my fulfillment in this and be respected as an individual for that. As a precursor to this episode, I probably should have started with this. You should really watch the Third Wave and the Pride of Lakewood videos that we did a few months ago. I will clean those up and repost them, because there were some technical issues on that. But in the meantime, I think we can take some calls. Let me bring up, if you would like to comment on what we've talked about today, what I've talked about today, then you can call 422-2222. Let me pull this up. Hopefully it will work. Okay. So I think that's all set up and good to go. I didn't change anything from last time. How you doing, Yugs? You've been really good boy. You've been so patient and quiet. Good boy. All right, so let's see what comments we have. Josh Kim says that human beings really just want to belong. I think that's a very true statement. And as much as we can acknowledge that it's true, it's a vulnerability that we can trip up on when people use that need that we have to belong to try to get us roped into something that they then use to control us. Bob Peck says depression, anxiety, or other mental health concerns, lack of self-confidence, self-esteem. These are things that make people ripe for an existential crisis. And the thing is, when you look at how religions target potential converts, they say, can you find someone who's had a recent tragedy in their life, a recent death of a family or a loved one? Because those are the people who are in these existential crises, who are vulnerable. They feel at most risk for, questioning their existence, questioning their worth, their value. And so that's when a religious group can pounce in and take it. At the same time, young adults and teenagers are a target demographic. That's why you find a lot of these religions go and specifically target college campuses. You've got people who are just growing out of childhood. They're starting to stand on their own 2 feet. They feel insecure about who they're going to be as adults. They feel insecure about transitioning from childhood to adulthood, from a young boy to a man, from a young woman or a girl to a woman. I think particularly in women, there are more changes than ever, because you've got your body changing, you've got the attention that you're receiving from your peers changing. There's all these different things that go into making women in particular feel susceptible. And this is why historically, when you look at certain psychological phenomenon, things like the eating disorders, cutting and so forth, there's a lot of them tend to happen in clusters, and they happen around young women. And that's just an aspect of the psychological landscape that mental health practitioners try to wrestle with and deal with. And we've seen those things sweep through our cultures and make a big footprint, and then they just seemingly go away. But there's something about that vulnerability of those late teenage years, early adulthood years, where your need to belong, your need to be worthy, your need to be lovable, all those things are vulnerabilities that can then get exploited by these distortions of thinking. Drunken Reaper says, a big part was just making peace with myself. At your baseline, it's okay to be you. That's a big part of it. A lot of these groups come with the idea that it's wrong to be who you are, you're broken, and you need them to fix you. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me? Okay, hold up. For some reason. All right, try speaking now. Can you hear me now? No.
Hello?
Okay, I think they can hear you, but I can't. So I am going to try reconnecting my phone. Give me just a second. I can't hear you if you're able to hear.
Okay, I do that. Haven't said too much. I just barely started hearing you.
Okay, try speaking now.
Hi.
Oh, okay, now I
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, I really like this episode. I left a comment on one of your earlier videos on how you avoid ideology. This pretty much answers my question.
Oh,
so
yeah, actually, I think I do remember that comment, and that kind of made me thinking, that's one of the things that I don't know how to articulate it. I've mentioned the God-shaped hole a few times before, but it's that's too simplistic a term. It's really what we've talked about in this episode, where these are just realities of our existence as human beings that tend to get exploited in different areas of our life.
Yeah. So one of the thoughts I had toward the end there, you were kind of talking about how we have to navigate and figure out where we're going to. So we have to try to have ourselves be the authority. And I was just thinking about just culture in general. I mean, culture, I don't think it's a coincidence that culture has cult in it. And I think we kind of submit to it a little bit when we are just living our everyday lives and stuff. And it's really, I don't know, it's tempting to like deconstruct everything to nihilism. And I don't know. It's really hard to do. It's hard to have that balance of like, where do you stop being bitter at the church and just start acknowledging that like there was some good there, like, I don't know. It's been a bumpy ride, but
well, I
anyway,
think it is helpful to kind of the way that I've done is you go through that phase where you're like, this church, they manipulated me, they gave me this distorted way of viewing, they made me think I was broken, and I'm going to find my own way out. And so then you go out and you look at the wider world around you and you see that this process is happening all over the place. And I think that's why there's the movies that talk about this thing of like waking up and then trying to deal with the world outside of a closed bubble is such a popular theme, whether it's The Matrix or Pleasantville or anything like that. It's because that's the hero's journey of every one of our lives. And the fact that it exists everywhere, even in all the, you try to be good and just be yourself, and you get involved in a group, and then suddenly you start seeing that these red flags are popping up everywhere. You're like, great, another, situation where I'm compelled to have to submit to groupthink. And a lot of it is, it's almost like it's a natural part of how we've evolved as a species, is that when we start operating in groups, some of these distortions pop up just by our psychology. And so I think a lot of it is just realizing it's going to show up, and then being informed enough that you can resist it, and being secure in your own self, your own standing, your own footing, that you're okay with walking away when you do need to walk away, and drawing that boundaries. And it can be tough because you do lose that community aspect of it. And that I think for me is the hardest thing to struggle with, is what do you do with the loss of the community?
Hmm. Yeah, I wondered a lot of those same things, and I've had the thought too, like I've seen that, I felt that, like I've felt that instinct to like that's all good or all bad, just all that black and white thinking. I think that's true that we kind of evolved that way, but I do see a lot of people that being in this space, like I was totally unaware of this space when I was a believer. Like I just didn't even realize what was going on here. And talking to a lot of nuanced believers has really opened my eyes to, I think there are people that manage being a part of the Mormon community without being succumb to the authority. Like they still have their personal authority and they manage that. And I think that's great for them. Me and my husband decided to leave. We removed our records, but because I can't find that balance of being honest. Like it was my integrity that essentially made it so I had to say something, because I didn't feel honest teaching with the certainty that is expected at church. Like it's totally expected that we know things, or at least the church knows things, and I just didn't believe that anymore. Like it just kind of slowly crumbled for me. But anyway,
well,
no, I thought it was great episode.
I think that's why we get those warning flags of if you leave the church, then you'll just fall for anything, or you'll become a moral relativist. And I think,
well, it is out there. It's scary.
Yeah,
that's why it's hard to like find that balance.
That was a big eye opener for me, is I have to go back and line up the timelines, but I would not be surprised if the time that Michel Foucault was very popular, where they saw that this philosophy was gaining traction in France and led to them justifying essentially pedophilia, that the leaders of the church would say, this is what the secular moral world has to offer, which is basically if we let go of our morality in religious authority in the church, then that's what the world's morality has. And so they were then able to use that as it's either this or that. You're either in the church and you follow God's law, or you're a moral relativist, a secular moral relativist, and you'll be, off doing whatever it is you want. When, that branch of thinking kind of waned for a while, we're seeing a resurgence of it in a new shape nowadays, but it's by all, it is in no way the only two ways of looking at the world. And so that's where the struggle is. I mean, you can see it happen even in real time. Like for me in real time, I don't know if you were out in 2018, I think it was, when I published an apology on the
I did, though it was a real thing. I did read about that. I was not aware of it at the time. We didn't. Your videos, when I first saw them, and I was even pretty skeptical of the church by then, you were still like, I was just like, that is just so mean. That's not fair. And so now I've been gone long enough that I'm like, I don't know how to explain it. Because even when I was doubting, I saw some of your videos and I was just like, well, that's not nice. I think they're good intention. Anyway, it's just funny how your perspective changes gradually.
Well,
I don't know.
It was interesting because in the wake of that, so it was published online as though it were a real news release with an apology on the issue of race. And it had subtle cues in it that it was a satire piece, but it was not subtle enough. And even major news outlets kind of thought it was real. And then when it became widespread and it was discovered that it was not real, there was a lot of hurt and pain expressed about it. And if you go to the online communities like in Reddit and in Facebook, there were people that early on were like, yeah, this is a great thing that really showed the hypocrisy of the church in it. And then you saw the debates and the discussion happen saying, no, this was oppressive and bad. It exploited the pain of Black people. There was a whole dimension of morality that was quickly adopted by much of the ex-Mormon community that hadn't thought about these issues in that way before, where now they see that anytime that there's a white person dealing with anything in race, because he is the dominant class, he's not allowed to really talk about these things. Now, they wouldn't get into the nuances of the fact that I'm 50% Hispanic, in that for me, my experience with Mormonism and racism was more on the Latin America side of things. And there's a whole bit of nuance to it, but you don't need to look for nuance when you've got a moral rule that you can then follow and divide the world into good, bad, racist, not racist. It's just all the nuance goes away when you've got these really rigid moral frameworks for it. But that's where I think a lot of people, even some of the people who helped me behind the scenes with the technical aspects of it, that were excited about it early on, totally flipped and said, you know what, don't ever say that I was a part of this, and I want nothing to do with this, and I should not have done this. And now have gone even to more ideological extremes where they're calling out white supremacy here, left and right, even though they are white, and calling things out as white supremacy that are a completely different nature than what we have understand white supremacy to be in the past. And so it's a really fraught world where everybody is ready to hand you a new moral litmus test that you can then attack the world with, and making sense of it all is very difficult. And it's, sometimes you just want to throw your hands up in the air and go and live as a hermit somewhere.
Yeah, I know. Well, so one thing that as I've kind of stepped away, I really try to follow, I try to engage with people like their good faith. And in order to do that, you can't think they're stupid. You can't think they're evil, or you can't think they're lying. You just you can't, because I think a lot of times, even when you're in a belief system, you're just like, oh, well, the Spirit hasn't talked to them yet, or they are probably not living righteously enough, or they are just, they're interpreting it the way they want it to be. You can just throw. But I think the only way you can actually hear people is when you actually, when you're actually listening, is if you can't think they're dumb or lying or bad faith. Like, you have to actually think the best of someone. And it's hard to do that online, especially because you don't have that background of engaging with them and seeing them engage with other people and seeing that they, are trying their best, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
that is
anyway,
such a good point. And I love that you brought that good faith point up, because we lose sight of it so much in internet debates.
Yeah.
That, and even I think some of these ways of looking at the world completely eliminate the good faith argument. And that is that if you can interpret offense from something that somebody says, then it doesn't matter what they meant. It doesn't matter what their intention is. The only thing that matters is that you were offended by it, or that it offended you in some way, and they are now bad. And that's one of those another red flag sort of things, where when you start to see that where the intention doesn't matter, then you've gone into some sort of radicalized ideological framework or mode there. And when you engage in these debates, extending good faith to people when you could interpret something that they say in a way that would reflect on them poorly, or you could take the best interpretation of it, you're going to do better in terms of connecting with people, in terms of being heard yourself, if you extend them the same good faith that you would want extended to you from their side. So I love that point. All right. Well, I don't know if I've lost you, but are you there? Hello, hello. Okay, well, I think we lost that caller, so we will move on. Thanks for calling, and hope to hear from you again soon. If you... Oh, I see, dropped call, no worries. Okay, so let's see here. If you want to join the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. All right. Let's see any other comments that we have. All the punk rock I listened to as a kid is starting to make sense, from Bob Peck. It's funny. My son pointed out to me that a lot of these heavy metal bands, like that, when we were growing up, they were all labeled as like satanic and everything. When you read them, a lot of what they're talking about is about religious abuse, religious and ecclesiastical abuse, and rejecting that. And it just kind of gave me a completely different way of seeing what some of the heavy metal stuff is. I'm still not a fan. I'm Cure, Depeche Mode, Pet Shop Boys. That's just what I am. Anyway, okay. Dita Von Cheese says the wrong is in making everyone be okay with each other or cutting off communication altogether. It's okay not to be okay with each other. That's a very good point. Okay, I think what I need to do is turn that off. Okay. Okay, so give me just a second because I have to get my headphone connected again. Okay, so give me a second, just be patient with me. Okay. And let's go to Bluetooth, connect. And then I'm going to stop this. Okay, my audio is going to go out just. Okay, I think we're better now. I apologize for that. Can you hear me? Okay. That is there. I can't hear anything, although I am connected there. So what I'll have you do is, well, hold on. Maybe if I turn this off and on, try again. Okay, I'm sorry. You're going to have to call back, unfortunately. Okay, well, maybe. Okay, that seems to be working now that hung up. I apologize for the technical stuff. That's just how it works. Okay, everybody lost sound. Okay, Mormonism does not have a monopoly on morality, but it may have carved out a corner of the market on a morally relative God. I think a lot of Mormons may see that comment and say, what do you mean that Mormonism has moral relativism? That's not what it has. Well, there's something to be said about that. All right. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Hey, this is Mike. How's it going?
Going good.
You know, I was calling. I was listening to you guys. Obviously, I've talked to you a few times before, but the thing with the God-shaped hole that kind of, I don't know, for some reason, I was a convert to the church. So when I got in, I kind of felt like Mormonism filled a little bit of what wasn't kind of fully there from my past religion, which was I grew up Lutheran. And then when I left, the whole wasn't so much what I lost from Mormonism as much as what I felt like I was risking with my marriage and my in-laws. And, I think what's funny about it is kind of being from that perspective. When I was a Lutheran, the God-shaped hole really wasn't there because they didn't really put fear into you if you didn't believe it. It was not a la carte, but it also wasn't like, if you don't take this, you're doomed. And then when I went into Mormonism, I always had that real horrible feeling like, if I walk away, I'm going to be in some serious trouble with my family. And then now, having, much later, finally been willing to go down the rabbit hole, you kind of see how a lot of the God-shaped hole, I think, impacts members more in the fear of what that hole is than what it actually is. And it's just so weird, like when I listened to you talk today, just because, as I've talked to my wife, who's still fully devout in the church, that, a lot of her responses are not like, I want to look into this because I want to know if it's true. If it's not true, what does that leave me? What kind of a person would I be? And it's just a really frustrating, I think, angle of Mormonism that, when I joined, I kind of noticed was off, but I didn't realize just how invasive it was until I left. And then even more so when I started doing kind of the deep dive into the research.
Yeah. I think there's an aspect, any metaphor is imperfect, and we use them just to try to convey certain ideas. One of the things that you're pointing to in this metaphor that I didn't explore too much was the idea that some ways of thinking, some ideologies can create the hole that they then fill. And that, I think that's a whole other branch in terms of giving you the idea that you're broken. And when you look back on your existence as a Lutheran, where you felt like there were certain aspects that weren't being fulfilled, was that the way that you saw at the time? Is that what led you to be attracted to Mormonism? Was that it answered some of the questions or some of the ways that you weren't being fulfilled before that?
You know what? Honestly, I started dating my now wife in high school. And so one day she goes, a lot of people said you might not like me anymore because I'm Mormon. I was like, I don't know what a Mormon is. I was so completely, I had never heard of a Mormon before. And then I think a few months later, her parents were like, get this kid the mission discussions. And then, that story is kind of screwy, for a lot of reasons. But yeah, I mean, when I started doing the missionary discussions, I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. And then you read the Book of Mormon and you're like, yeah, this doesn't seem that weird because it really isn't the Book of Mormon itself. And, it's a different tangent, but it's not that weird. But then you hear the things about eternal families, and in my head I'm not thinking like, I already expect to be with my family after death. You're just like, oh, this is cool. Now you're guaranteed to be with your family, and so it filled these little gaps and these little questions. But then like all of a sudden, to your point, like when I was a Lutheran, it wasn't like, again, it wasn't like, hey, if you walk away, you're gonna be fine. It just wasn't like, you need us more than we need you. It felt like it didn't feel like they were carving out this hole that when you walk away, you look back and go, holy crap, how do I fill this? It was more like, here's a way to make your week better. And so, to your early point, it wasn't that I was attracted to Mormonism because I felt like I was missing something. It just happened to be that I had never heard of it before. And I was introduced to it through my then girlfriend, now wife. And so, obviously that had, and the funny thing about that is just the hole that was created by going through Mormonism was not just the church. It was the actions that my in-laws took about my, reluctance to join because I was living with my parents at the time that also created a hole. And so, but again, looking back on it, I realized that was also created because her parents were doing what they thought was what was in the best interest, of their eternal family. It's just, it's the whole, I think that's why when I was listening to you, I was like, yeah, it's funny just because now I look at it from the perspective of like my believing wife, who I think she views it as this massive hole if she walks away. And I think that keeps people from even looking because they're like, I can't fill that because I've been told my whole life that this hole is just too big to walk away from and still be able to be a happy person and a thriving person.
Yeah, it really speaks to that point where you can know if a religion or a group is helpful or hurtful by seeing if there are support groups for people who survive it and escape it. And to that extent, when you're in Mormonism, like I am, where you were raised in it, you're given the idea that all religions interact with an individual the same way that Mormonism interacts with the individual. And one of the eye-opening things that I've had going and exploring and just seeing how other religions operate is that they don't. They don't give you the message that every aspect of your life has to be dictated by the commands of the religion. And so, like, I've mentioned before how I interact with the local Lutheran congregation, and I can totally get what you're talking about, like not really feeling like it was, directing your life that way. And the thing is, that's kind of one of the signs of a healthy religious paradigm, where they allow you and your conscience and your own connection with the divine to determine what the nature and extent of your spiritual walk is. And so if you leave a particular congregation, you're not going to feel as much of a whole because the answers didn't get handed to you from the authorities of that organization. They were things that you were allowed to foster within yourself. And and so I don't know, the idea that you could go from the paradigm where you're not so infantilized, and then you get into the authoritarian religious paradigm of Mormonism, and so all of those things that previously you felt fine on, now they occupy that space, and when you leave it, you're left like wanting or needing or craving the certainty, the answers, and those things that the church provided before. It's a difficult thing. I think.
Yeah, and like I said, go ahead.
Infantilization is a big part of that, where you are prevented from working through difficult moral issues on the basis of moral persuasion. And so you never have to struggle with first principles, and work them into a complex way of thinking about a difficult moral issue. All you have to do is say, well, what do the brethren say? They say no. Okay, the answer is no. So it's like a form of muscle that you flex that is, just as much as thinking through any other thing gives you experience in thinking through issues. And so if you live your life without ever having to flex those muscles, when you leave it, they have atrophied, and it becomes harder to navigate important moral issues, or to start from first principles, or even to know what principles that you can rely on, because the principles that you were handed, you found to be, impeached and illegitimate.
Yeah, and I think the funny thing to that is, like, when I left, that was a lot of what I got from the leadership in my ward, was basically like, because long story short, my problem started with polygamy just because that was the only thing I knew about. It really bothered me. And as stupid as it sounds, when you grow up with your wife who you grew up with in high school, and you always kind of have that jealousy because you're in high school, like when you're with different groups and all that. And I always used to think, like, man, like, she used to get jealous when we were in high school, and I would hang out with, another group of friends that had girls in it. And I think, how would she like it if I was, married to another girl? But and then all of a sudden I started kind of pulling back after I went through the temple. We got married civilly, and then the elders quorum president kept pulling me aside. He's like, if you don't start coming to more activities, you're going to start missing out on your, potential and all that. And I was thinking to myself, like, I can't do it, because I felt so, like, messed up as far as, like, trying to balance keeping my wife happy with also the fact that I was just completely struggling with the church. And then all of a sudden, I said, I need some time to figure out what I'm doing. And the next week they called me to be, a counselor in the elders quorum presidency. And I'm like, what? How do you think this is going to end? And then I turned it down. It was like, they looked at me like I was stabbing them in the chest. And then they're like, you do realize, when you turn down a calling, what you're giving up. And that I think was one of those moments where, to your point, it's like when I was part of the Lutheran church, people would leave and no one ever said, like, oh, wow, look what they're just like, oh, they haven't come in a while, no big deal. Maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't, hopefully they're happy. And it's just, it really just kind of put that extra layer of fear into me, not so much about the whole, from, losing Mormonism as much as just like, I have to deal with my in-laws and my wife to navigate it. And that's why I think, to your earlier, point, it's just like, when, you're born in it, it's just like, it was weird because I wasn't born in it. And so I'd see this from other people and I just thought, why are you like this? And then all of a sudden after, a period of time, you start realizing it. It was so jarring because I couldn't really see it while I was really kind of in And then as soon as I started, kind of started having issues, I started kind of leaning back on my pre-Mormonism time. That was how I filled the hole, was kind of going, well, I can just fall back on Christianity in general. And but then you still see all these things that are just so, I don't know what the word is. It was just disturbing in the sense of, like, I know, for example, my wife is a smart person. And if you were to bring up anything problematic with another religion or a politician, or she's like, oh yeah, that's totally not true. But then when you bring it up for Mormonism, it's like, I can't be happy without this, so I don't want to, I don't care. It's just, it just feels like, the whole is created while you're a believer. It's not even that when you walk away that, you were kind of saying that anyways, but it's just, I guess for some reason, it's like the fear of the whole, I think a lot of people is worse than the whole itself. And it's just just from, my perspective was just so jarring when I left, just because it was hard to kind of understand why they were, I don't know how to phrase it, I don't want to sound offensive. It's just why the church membership in the ward was so like scared of people that walked away. And then you go through it and you're like, oh, that's why. But it's such a created fear. And I guess for some reason, that's why it's always bothered me, just because it feels so manufactured, yet at the same time, it's just so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. And that fear is part of what they constantly remind you of. The whole notion of, well, where will you go? That's a call to that fear. If you lose the certainty that you have with all of the answers and all the security that we provide you, where will you go? Who else can give you that security? And it's a created form of dependence that does come with its own price when you consider losing it. And you're absolutely right. It keeps people in place and believing, because, what will they go? Where will they do things? And it's really until you take that step and you realize that the journey of discovering where you're going to go, of reclaiming your own authority, of determining where you go, and that it's okay for you to go there is such a valuable aspect of really maturing and really growing up and moving out of that infantile state, because you don't even realize that it's infantile. You have all the trappings of being an adult, but you haven't gone through the mental maturation that goes along with dealing with complex issues without simply relying on religious authority. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, but anyways, thank you so much for all the shows, and keep up the good work, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
All right, take care. Thanks for the call.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye now. Okay. All right, let's see here. So if you want to join in and call, you can dial 210-422-2222. Yu-Gi-Oh left me in a fit of barkies. Yu-Gi-Oh! He left me all alone. All right. Let's see if there are any other comments. Okay, we got another call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
John, how's it going?
All right, what's on your mind?
So a quick question on your diagram. Not necessarily exclusive to Mormonism, but that's what I was raised in, so that's my background. But as far as the fundamental questions, at least I think that's how the church frames it, the questions of, where did we come from, why are we here, and where do we go? Less about a group theory on that, but your own. I'm very curious of your own view of that. When leaving either a high demand religion or a fundamentalist group or a rigid ideology, where do you think we turn or should turn or possibly could turn to find an answer to essentially a purpose in life, and not just the extremely microscopic your life, but life in general?
I try not to be prescriptive in terms of what journey people should go on when they leave the church. I try mostly to focus on just the areas where we can learn from the lessons of Mormonism and the type of distortions that go on with that. For me, a lot of it is just keeping an open mind, leaving the idea that things that are moral or good can only come by religious decree from men who have claimed that title. And so I allow myself to find meaning and beauty in in my own life experiences, in mythology, in story, in movies and literature, in memes, in, just in my whole world around me, allow them to give me meaning and to find purpose in being there for the people that I love and trying to, live life in a way that I can show my love for those people around me, and that they will find their own lives enriched by, having me be a part of it. Those are the things that for me have given me purpose. And these external things in terms of what religious demands any particular faith may say that I need to comply with in order to gain God's favor, I don't know. That you could say, well, you need to be Christian in this particular mode. And as soon as they're like this particular mode, then that has a whole list of things that I'm supposed to do if I want to see myself as good. And just the fact that there's a list handed to me by somebody else is one of those red flags. And so I've felt very comfortable in the past saying that I resonate a great deal with Christianity, with the ideas of love for your fellow man, love for yourself, love for God in how you see it expressed in the world around you. I can get along with people whose worldview is rooted in that, to the extent that they don't try to impose it on me. And so, and all of the blessings and all of the glorious afterlife aspects of that worldview sound beautiful. And so, are they real? I hope they're real. And, I think I can consider myself a hopeful Christian in that very narrow mode of, wanting to live my life according to this notion of Christian love that's centered around loving your neighbors and yourself and finding wholeness and fulfillment in those acts of love. Not using religious dogma to condemn or demonize other people. Even scripture, even Mormon scripture or Mormon talks, finding the things that are good in them and, to the extent that they're worthy of integrating into your life, doing that. But doing that with the idea that when you see something that is bad or morally disruptive or would lead to inevitably hateful outcomes, being able to say that and not having to stay silent on it. And so I think just all of that is centered around being able to be the captain of my own ship as I navigate all of these different influences, and then choosing to pursue those directions which are more articulated by love and empathy than ones directed by self-righteousness or piety, because those things end up just with bad outcomes. And I think the reason that you see me talk a little bit more about secular moralism is that a lot of the red flags that I learned to detect in the realm of religion, I'm now seeing come up in the moral philosophy that is taking shape as the way the world operates outside of the paradigm of religion. And as much as I've been a student of history and seen how different moral movements have swept through other countries, motivated by the same sentiments of social justice, looking out for the oppressed and the downtrodden, those taglines, those sentiments were behind plenty of revolutions in the past that have ended up being some of the bloodiest chapters in human history. So just because you can put the tagline, looking out for the oppressed, looking out for the workers, looking out for the common man, just because you can put that tagline on a movement does not mean it's actually a worthy movement. And that's where really looking at what is behind the philosophy driving the movement and whether that's consistent with my own views of how I would want to be treated, no matter where I was born into the world. It's kind of helped me navigate that a little bit. So that's a little bit of my own perspective on it. But I don't prescribe how people should look at these things. I think there are people who leave the church that want nothing at all to do with religion and would never consider it necessary to say anything good about religion. Certainly say bad things about religion because you need to warn people away from that. And I don't fall into that category. I think that there is enough goodness in the way many of religions operate, that they can be as justified as existing as the Lions Club or the Rotary Club, to the extent that they allow people to continue to maintain their own free will and dignity, free of the type of undue influence and unethical coercion that we talk about here.
Okay. And that, I think that makes sense to me on kind of the microscopic scale for yourself, whether that's using Christianity and more just the idea of a heaven as a backdrop for finding hope, and possibly even, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but kind of trying to make this life the heaven you hope for later.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is, I early on realized that this fear of the afterlife and fear of loss of eternal existence created a lot of personal anguish for me. And since it is in the category of the unknown, I've put it in the category of, I don't know, the whole notion that I have of it is been conceived and conceptualized by the statements of religious men claiming authority from God to say what they were. And so I have no idea what is real in that regard. And so I'm not going to pay attention to the carrot or the stick for that, in terms of trying to live up to some other person's idea of what hoops I have to jump through to get into that. There's this, I think it's attributed to Marcus Aurelius, where, if you live a good life and if God is okay with your life of goodness, treating other people equitably or whatever, then that's good. If it's not okay, then, he wouldn't be a worthy God to not accept that type of life. I totally butchered that quote, but it's around there somewhere. But I resonate with that idea, is that, this whole question of who has the authority to determine what the afterlife is and what you have to do to get there. That's where all these different voices from all these different religions try to get their hooks into you for that. And I just don't want that to be the driving factor in me wanting to treat other people well.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's interesting that the fear of, I think of it as a fear of a later judgment based on rules that either you're unaware of or rules that to you don't seem moral or tenable. I think we actually live with that fear in today's society. When you start talking about like secular moralism, I think we do live in a certain level of fear that something you say right now on a podcast, or something a celebrity says or a politician says in the public sphere will be condemned by the, air quotes, gods 10 years from now, and condemn them. And so, like you're saying, focusing on the good and the best you can do right now is really the only thing you can do, whether the later you're worried about is the post-mortem or just the later relative morality of society as that changes. I'm grateful for people like you or George Washington or whoever that did the best that they could. And I think in the end, it does make a positive difference, even though those historical figures and current figures absolutely will have their flaws based on future people looking back. But that really resonates with me, John. And I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of explain that at maybe a different perspective. Thank you, John.
Yeah. I just want to comment real quick on the thing that you said, because this is something that has popped into my head much more frequently in the recent time, where you're talking about, we may talk about something now, and then 5 years from now, they're going to say things that we thought were totally banal are now racist or bigoted in some way, and we had no idea. I just see that as an expression of the religious cycle that you see some particularly high demand religions go in, where you establish a moral framework, and then that demand for purity drives you to a more and more puritanical way of condemning any degree of iniquity according to that moral framework, and essentially canceling people spiritually if you can accuse them of having it. So we think of the Puritan culture as having that sort of thing, where you've got the really strict, rigid moralist who's going to put a scarlet A on you if you have any degree of sin about you. And the way that I've learned that more Christian way of thinking is specifically kind of a response to that in the modern era. And that is that, the way that you can diffuse that kind of purity-based condemnation of everybody is to say, okay, we're all sinners and nobody's perfect. And to the extent that anyone claims moral superiority in order to condemn somebody else, that act in and of itself is a breach of morality. And so if you can get to a point where you're like that, then if you start from everybody is a sinner, then you're not going to sit there and condemn everybody for not living up to any particular rule, and you can actually live together because nobody's an angel. We all have imperfections. We all fall short of even our own personal ideals. And so I'm much more comfortable living among Christians that adopt that philosophy than I am among the secular moralists that is becoming more and more popular today, where if anyone makes a statement that can be interpreted as racist or bigoted, regardless of what the intention is, you point the finger, condemn them as racist or bigoted, and cancel them completely, deplatform them, basically dehumanize them and cut them out of society. Because that's simply a secular moral expression of this religious Puritanism. It's just in the secular realm. And I don't want any part of it. And to the extent that you can't predict where that's going to go, there was a period of time where it was okay to say that people were African American. Well, now that's racist. Well, it was time to say, you could say black. Well, no, that's racist. It has to be people of color. And then the people who were like, no, it has to be people of color, condemned everyone who said black or African American. Well, now it has to be BIPOC. I can't believe you said people of color when it should be BIPOC. And so you condemn as racist everyone. And it's a radicalization. You're becoming more and more extreme in creating more and more reasons to condemn other people. And I don't want to live in a society where that's simply what we're doing, is creating ways to condemn and exclude other people for the language they use, regardless of their intention. And that's where that charity principle that we were talking about earlier, if you take away this notion of condemnation and extend charity to people, then I think we have a much healthier recipe for actually living and working together and accepting that we're all imperfect and giving people grace in that regard. So I'm hopeful that there's enough people that see value in the concept of grace and charity, even though those are words affiliated with certain types of Christianity. They are principles that actually foster a healthy, vibrant society a lot better than simply condemning everybody regardless of their intention for who they are, for the color of their skin.
Oh, for sure. I think that absolutely benefits society, whether, on the micro or the macro scale. I don't think it's actually very beneficial on the marketing scale or the war front, obviously. Yeah. I think you've got competing factors there. As far as whether or not that's tenable in the long run, but I think they're absolutely honorable. And I think if everybody was keen on doing that, it would be a better world. But I also think there are factors of, limited resource, or people want to be better than each other. I think competition and things like that are also as much in our nature as a desire to feel a sense of belonging. I think is inseparably coupled to if you belong to group A, then by definition there has to be a group B, and eventually groups as they grow bigger have those schisms. And so trying to find that sweet spot where you feel special and that you have a community, but also feeling superior in some ways is as human as anything else. I'm curious to see what that shapes in my own life and yours, but it's just fascinating stuff to talk to you. And I love hearing your perspective, John. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the call. All right. Okay. Let's see here. All right. 123 Neil says, I need to work on giving this good faith charity to the church. It's so hard, but I think I will be happier for it. That's the balance you pay is, does charity mean that you can never criticize anything? Should you just always, assume? And that's where, as much as you should extend charity as much as is reasonably possible when you're dealing with having to, confront abuses, confront manipulation, there's a way of understanding that it would be not charitable to vulnerable people to not talk about those things. There's a really fascinating talk that I can provide a link to, see if I can find it, at the recent April 8th symposium hosted by Harvard about child sexual abuse. And one of the talks given by a religious fellow from Duke University, I believe, was about de-weaponizing forgiveness. And he starts out by explaining how the demand for forgiveness has actually been used against abuse victims, because their abusers will say that the Christian imperative is that you forgive me if you believe that I've abused you in any way, and will impose that on the person. And if you take it at that narrow view of the way the offender wants you to see forgiveness, then it essentially is another form of spiritual abuse to the victim. But if you look at a broader picture of society as a whole, the nature of the crimes that are happening in abuse and what we need to do to show love to any other potential victims, as well as to the individual himself, him or herself, that in a way that respects their dignity and their autonomy, you can't simply just forgive the offender. Forgiveness by necessity requires accountability, restitution, and it does not involve imposing a demand or expectation of individual forgiveness on the part of the abuser themselves. It was just a really excellent talk, and I'll provide a link to that if I can find it. Okay, so if you would like to join the conversation, I think we probably can do one more call at 210-422-2222. If I go into my history here, let's see, there was something that, oh yeah, so there was a talk earlier about, or a comment earlier about Mormons being a relativistic, a moral relative religion, and that may be a surprising sentiment to some people, but if you take time and listen to the talk about the happiness letter, where Joseph Smith lays out his moral ethic to Nancy Rigdon, the daughter of Sidney Rigdon, as a justification for his proposal to her that they get married in secret and against the law and without the knowledge of Emma, he makes the case that his illegal secret marriage proposal is actually good, is actually moral. And he does so by saying that whether or not something is moral hinges on whether or not a man designated by God, i.e. a prophet of God, says that God says it's moral. So if God says it's moral, then it's moral, simply by religious decree. And that is the very definition of moral relativism, in that you impart to a man claiming God's power the ability to transcend morality and basically declare something you would previously consider to be immoral and wrong as moral simply because he said so. Okay, so let's see. I may have put that on my page. I'd take a $100,000 restitution. I agree with you. I think they should not only give us our tithing, but they should take what that amount of tithing grew into in the instant peak and give us the interest on the tithing and the gain on the tithing. If they can expect our gain, we can expect their gain. Okay. All right. Well, without any other calls, we're right at the 2-hour mark. I will go ahead and close it down. This was a very unstructured discussion of just things that were popping into my head. I've got a problem where I'll kind of start to think about something that I want to talk about, and then I never talk about it, and I never put it out there or vomit it on the page, and so it just disappears. There's a whole litany of things like that. So we will go ahead and close it down, just as Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh, come here. What are you doing? You left me the whole time. What in the world? I better not find any Tootsie Rolls over there. You hear me, dude? All right. Until next time, it's Talk on Things and Stuff. Bye now.